If you avoid using some English grammar tenses because you're not really sure how to use them or why you should, it can lead to unnecessary grammar mistakes. It can also make it far more difficult to say exactly what you want to say in English conversations. In today's Confident English lesson, we're going to do an in-depth exploration of the past continuous tense in English, also known as the past progressive. This means we'll review the past continuous structures so that you use them accurately. And more importantly, you'll learn 6 real-life examples of when to use the past continuous. What that means is by the end of this lesson today, you'll be 100% ready to confidently answer 3 questions I have for you using the past continuous tense in English. But first, if you don't already know, I'm Anne-Marie with Speak Confident English. Everything I do is designed to help you get the confidence you want for your life and work in English. One way I do that is with these Confident English lessons, where I share my top fluency and confidence building strategies, advanced level vocabulary, and targeted grammar lessons, just like this one today. So while you're here, make sure you subscribe to my Speak Confident English channel on YouTube so you never miss one of these Confident English lessons. Before we look at 6 specific examples of when to use the past continuous form, let's focus on the structure so that you're able to use this tense accurately. In the positive form, we have a subject and then the past form of the verb to be, was or were, followed by an ing verb. For example, I was planning to call you, but I lost track of time. Then in the negative form, once again, we have a subject, the past form of the to be verb, was or were, followed by not, and an ing verb. For example, she wasn't sleeping when you called. She was working with her phone on Do Not Disturb. In addition to making sure the structure is accurate, it's also important to be careful with your word choice. We don't use stative verbs in the past continuous form. Stative verbs are used to describe a state of mind or a state of being. These are verbs such as believe, like, dislike, hate, love, need, prefer, realize, seem, understand, or want. For example, we would not say, when I was younger, I was preferring to drink coffee. That doesn't work in English. Instead, we would say, when I was younger, I preferred to drink coffee. Stative verbs imply continuous or ongoing action. So the use of the past progressive form, which can also imply continuous or ongoing action in the past, is unnecessary. With all of that in mind, let's get into 6 real-life examples of how and when to use the past continuous in English. The first use is to provide background or context when telling stories. Of course, when you tell a story, you're referencing the past. You're talking about something that already happened, something you experienced. And to help make a story more interesting, you provide context. In other words, the background to help set the tone of the story or to create a mood. Doing all of this creates a mental picture for your listener. This is when we use the past continuous tense for telling stories. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're telling someone about a recent vacation. And to highlight just how relaxing it was from the very first day, you might share some background details. What was happening the moment you woke up that first day? In telling your vacation story, you might say, the very first morning I woke up, the waves were gently rolling up on shore. The sun was just inching up over the mountains, warming the sun, and the palm leaves were rustling in the breeze. It was the perfect start to my vacation. All of those background details are in the past continuous tense, and they help to provide context. Let's take a look at another example. Think for a moment about an important historical event you've experienced. And imagine someone asking you, what were you doing when? What were you doing when you first heard the election results? In telling that story and providing some background details, you might say, I was at an election party. A group of us were chatting and the music was blaring when they first announced the results. There was so much noise that we didn't hear them right away. This example leads me to use number 2. We use the past continuous to highlight overlapping events or interruptions. Let's start by talking about overlapping events. In other words, when two things are happening at the same time. To show that two events are overlapping and to indicate which one started first, we use the past continuous. There are two structures we typically use to highlight these overlapping events. The first one is to use the past continuous followed by when and the past simple form. I was chatting with friends when they announced the results. Or we could reverse that. When they announced the results, I was chatting with friends. In both cases, the use of the past continuous highlights which of the two events started first. The second structure we can use is to include a specific indication of time that highlights something was happening before and after. For example, at midnight, at 7 p.m., in September, by the age of 12. Let me give you a few examples of how we might use these indications of time. Number 1, by the age of 12, I was playing concerts in major cities around the country. This tells us the statement was true before and after that specific indication of time. A second example, by the time I was in my mid-30s, I was already putting away a significant portion of my paycheck toward my retirement savings. And number 3, I was cooking dinner at 7 p.m. last night. Again, this highlights that you were cooking dinner before and after that period of time. And now let's talk about interruptions. The past continuous shows what was happening when an interruption occurred. For example, imagine you missed an important call from a loved one, and when they finally reach you, they want to know what was going on. Why didn't you answer the phone? In your response, you might say, I was cooking in the kitchen and the kids were watching TV at full volume when you called. I didn't hear the phone. In another example, perhaps you've had a chaotic morning, and in describing this entire morning to a coworker, you might include this detail. The kids were sleeping deeply when the alarm rang and jolted them awake. Before we move on to use 3, I want you to look again at those examples with interruptions and notice that we're using that same structure we used with overlapping events. We're using the past continuous with when and the past simple. Use number 3 is to emphasize a length of time, such as all day or all afternoon. Now, why might it be useful or important to emphasize a length of time? Let me illustrate with an example. Imagine you've recently accomplished a major milestone at work. You and your team have just finished an all-consuming project, and you want to emphasize how much time you've spent on it. The past continuous combined with phrases that explain the length of time help you do this. In describing this effort to others, you might say, we were working on this project non-stop all year. It's hard to believe it's finished. In addition to using a phrase such as all year, you could use all day, all night, all month, all week, all morning, all afternoon, all evening. You could also use for hours, for days, for weeks, for months, for years. Here's another example many parents might identify with. Imagine being a new parent and telling a friend just how difficult it was to get good sleep last night. In that conversation, you might say, "It was a terrible night. She was crying all night, and we hardly slept." The fourth use of the past continuous tense on this list today is to discuss past habits using words such as always and usually. Now, you might be thinking, Anne-Marie, I thought we used the present simple to talk about habits, and you're right, we do. If there is a habit I currently have, I would use the present simple. For example, I always read before bed. But what if a habit is no longer true? Perhaps you've broken a bad habit, or maybe you grew out of one. This is where the past continuous is helpful. It tells us about a past habit that is no longer true. To do this, we use the past continuous form combined with adverbs and adverb phrases that describe frequency, such as always, constantly, usually, rarely, all the time, the entire time. For example, imagine you're reminiscing about your first year in your current job. While you reflect on that time, you might say, "During my first year, I was constantly making mistakes. There was so much to learn." You could also use the past continuous tense combined with an indication of frequency to describe some annoying past habits. For example, in describing where you used to live, you might say, "The entire time we lived in that neighborhood, our neighbors were constantly yelling and partying every other night. In the end, we decided to sell the house and move to a more peaceful neighborhood." Our fifth use of the past continuous form is in making a polite request using the structure, "I was wondering if." In using this highly polite, indirect way of making a request, we're using the past continuous form. We tend to use this structure when we want to be overly polite because we're worried someone will say no. For example, if you're asking a friend for a favor and you say, "I was wondering if we could borrow your truck for our move." Or if you're inviting a coworker to your house for the very first time, you might say, "I was wondering if you're free this weekend. We're having a few friends over for a backyard barbecue. We'd love for you to join us." You can also use this structure without the word if to ask indirect questions. This is useful when you're not sure if a question is appropriate. For example, "I was wondering what you're doing this weekend." A direct way of asking that question is, "What are you doing this weekend?" Another example is, "We were wondering when you'll have a decision." A direct way of asking that is simply, "When will you have a decision?" Now, as I said, this structure can be a very polite, indirect way of making requests, but it's important not to overuse it. This structure of "I was wondering if" is considered vague language. Vague language can be difficult to understand and it can make your meaning less clear. The last use of the past continuous form on this list today is to indicate a change of mind. Have you ever made a plan and then changed your mind at the last minute? Of course you have. We've all done that. The past continuous helps to identify what our original plan was and what we decided in the end. For example, imagine you made plans to move to another city at some point in time in the past. Originally, you were thinking of moving to one specific city, but in the end, you changed your mind and decided to move somewhere else. In talking through that process, you could say, "I was planning to move to Washington, D.C. originally, but in the end, I decided to move to New York." Similarly, let's say that you're talking to someone about your upcoming plans for a vacation. In the process of planning, the cost of airline tickets and long delays at airports changed your original plans. You might tell your friend, "We were originally planning to go back to Europe because we haven't been in years, but the cost of airline tickets and the long delays changed our minds. We decided we'll go somewhere closer to home." Now that you have these 6 clear uses of the past continuous form in English, it's time to practice. I have 3 questions for you. I want you to answer these 3 questions using the past continuous. Question number 1. Think about your last vacation. What was the first day like? Share some contextual or background details about your vacation. Question number 2. What was a past habit that you broke or grew out of? You can use a sentence structure such as, when I was a kid, I constantly, I always, I usually, and then continue with the past continuous form. And then question number 3, tell me about a time when you changed your mind. What was your original plan and what did you decide in the end? As always, you can share your answers to those questions with me in the comments below. If you found this lesson helpful to you, I would love to know, and you can tell me in one super simple way. Give this lesson a thumbs up here on YouTube. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss my future Confident English lessons. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.